Alright, in this video we're going to be looking at the interactionist approach, this time looking at how the interactionist approach can explain schizophrenia. In the next video we'll be looking at how the interactionist approach to treating schizophrenia occurs. So the interactionist approach to explaining schizophrenia really acknowledges how complex schizophrenia actually is. And rather than trying to determine what the correct explanation is, whether that's biological, psychological, environmental or social, it's probably best to perceive schizophrenia as developing through several interacting factors. And then by extension, obviously then trying to view a combination of different types of therapies, biological and psychological, as the best form of treatment. So as we've looked at, schizophrenia can be explained in a number of different ways. In terms of biological explanations, we've looked at genetic vulnerability and increased concordance rates between monozygotic twins and first-degree relatives of somebody with schizophrenia. And we've also looked at neurochemical, like dopamine, and neuroanatomical abnormalities like enlarged ventricles. The number of psychological factors as well, like stresses and life events as well. We know that significant life events can often be the trigger and lead to the onset of the disorder in people who are already vulnerable. And we've also looked at family dysfunction, which could be regarded as a social or a psychological explanation. So we know that there are thousands, it seems like every week there's a brand new explanation for schizophrenia, and these can fall into biological, psychological or social factors. It's not that one is necessarily more successful than another. We have to acknowledge that it's probably a combination of all of these factors. So one way to present an interactionist approach is through this diathesis stress model. And this is a model that we've come across before in the A-level psychology course. Schizophrenia is basically perceived as resulting from the combination of some sort of biological or internal vulnerability or biological factor and some external stress trigger, the stressor. So schizophrenia is being seen as triggered or worsened when the environmental stressor, for example, smoking cannabis, combines with some sort of biological diathesis or vulnerability. So the diathesis stress model of schizophrenia can be best summarized with this phrase here. Schizophrenia is the result of the combination of a vulnerability to the illness and the stress needed for it to become a reality. So we've looked at diathesis stress models before, but we've looked at what are now considered to be really, really outdated models. So the original diathesis stress model, also known as Meehl's model, said that diathesis was a genetic vulnerability. Nowadays, what we know of diathesis is much, much more complex, and we've got a better understanding of what these internal vulnerabilities could be. So, as we've previously outlined in the biological explanations, research indicates that schizophrenia has a biological component with many genes, i.e. it is polygenic, with many genes combining to increase a person's risk of developing the disorder. And it's likely that a lot of those genetic factors are linked to dopaminergic systems. So there is no one schizogene, but there are many genes that are involved, and each of these genes increases somebody's risk of genetic vulnerability, but only slightly. As we've said, schizophrenia is etiologically heterogeneous, which means that different combinations of genes combine in different ways in different individuals to increase their own individual vulnerability. So there is not one single schizogene that has been identified. But that's the old model, saying that diathesis must be a genetic vulnerability. Nowadays, we've got much more complex understandings of what diathesis can mean. And one of these is the neurodevelopmental model. This model basically says that diathesis, those internal vulnerabilities, go beyond just genetics. And actually, those internal vulnerabilities could be caused from psychological trauma. Now, I know that seems like an external factor, but just hear me out. Early childhood trauma affects brain development. It can hinder brain development. It can cause changes to the HPA axis, which, as we know, is involved in the fight or flight response. So early childhood trauma can affect how our body responds to stress. So having our HPA system in early life being triggered very frequently or for extended periods of time in the case of some sort of chronic stress, that can influence how our body responds to stress later on and can make the person much more vulnerable to later stress in adolescence and adulthood. So early childhood trauma and psychological trauma in those critical years can affect brain development, can affect hormonal responses, and can actually create an internal vulnerability that increases a person's risk for developing schizophrenia. So you can see here that this diathesis and our understanding of what is a diathesis is much more complex nowadays. It's gone from just a schizogene to schizophrenia being polygenic and many genes being involved, to now this neurodevelopmental model which says that even psychological traumas can cause internal vulnerabilities that make a person more likely to develop schizophrenia in later life. So the diathesis is our internal vulnerability. It can be genetic, but not necessarily. This combines with the stressor, the stress in the diathesis stress model, and this is some sort of external stress trigger. And we know that there are many, many different external factors that can increase somebody's risk. So originally they were just psychological. Originally we were looking at the schizophrenogenic mother, and other examples of family dysfunction. But nowadays we've got many other external stresses that can trigger schizophrenia. We know that those critical life events, which we discussed earlier, so for instance, going away to university is a significant one. Divorce, marriage, all of these, having children, these major life events can be that trigger, can be that stressor, which combines with a diathesis to increase somebody's risk. We know that urban living is also a risk factor and can provide that stressor. So living in a city increases somebody's risk 2.37 times. So there's a 2.37 times higher risk for those that are living in urban areas. And we know that cannabis is also an environmental trigger. So smoking cannabis increases somebody's risk of developing schizophrenia by 7 times. But of course, that's relative to dose, i.e. the more you smoke, the greater your risk. And we think this is because it interferes with the dopamine system. But our understanding is still pretty limited in terms of how exactly cannabis is interacting and increasing somebody's risk of the disorder. So as we can see, the diathesis stress model is not as simple as just saying genes plus cannabis equals schizophrenia. It is much more complex nowadays. Having said that, we still don't have many of the answers. So let's have a look first of all at research support. Now we've kind of touched on Tianari's research in other areas of the course. If you're going to know one study throughout the whole schizophrenia topic, make sure it's this one, because it can apply to biological explanations, it can apply to psychological explanations, and it can be used to either support or criticize them. So it's a really, really handy one to have up your sleeve. And in our next video, we're going to be looking at how interactionist approaches to treating schizophrenia are the most successful. And so that will come in the next video. However, there are still so many questions over how the interaction actually occurs. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's start off with Tianari's research, a very, very famous study here. So in this research, Tianari was assessing psychiatric records, and they were looking at inpatients who had suffered from schizophrenia and had given birth, had biological children who were adopted away. So basically they're adopted into families away from the biological mother that had schizophrenia. And they had a matched control group of adoptees who didn't have a schizophrenic mother. So here we've got a natural experiment where we've got a high-risk group who have potentially a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia and a low-risk group who do not have any genetic risk for schizophrenia. So they assessed these adoptees at 12 and 21 years, which is important as we know that the onset of schizophrenia is quite often late teens and early 20s, particularly for men. And these adoptees were assessed on a variety of elements of family dysfunction. So they were looking at how much conflict and criticism there was in the family and how many environmental stresses were present. So here they were really looking at the stresses. And up here, we're looking at the diathesis. So the psychiatrists who were assessing the adoptees didn't know whether that adoptee's biological mother was schizophrenic or not. So we've got a blind procedure here to avoid, obviously, any investigator bias. So what were the findings? Well, really, really interesting. So adoptees who had a high genetic risk, i.e. they had biological mothers who had suffered from schizophrenia, were at a greater risk of developing schizophrenia. this tells us that genes are involved. So this is a strength of bioexplanations. However, this increased risk only manifested when those children were adopted into dysfunctional families, i.e. families that had high EE, high criticism, etc. Those adoptees who did not have schizophrenic mothers, so the matched control group, so those that had low genetic risk, had no increased risk even if they were adopted into those dysfunctional families that demonstrated high EE. So, some really, really interesting things going on here. It shows that a combination of genetic vulnerability and family stress can lead to greatly increased risk of schizophrenia. But just having family stress or just having genetic vulnerability alone were not enough. It needed to be the combination of genetic factors and family stress that increased one's risk. It also seems like being reared in a healthy adoptive family, so being involved in a family that didn't show high EE, was a protective factor. So those that had a genetic predisposition, their mothers had schizophrenia, who were adopted into healthy families did not show any increased risk of developing the disorder, which means that despite having the diathesis, the fact that they didn't then have that stressor of family dysfunction means that they were not at increased risk of developing the disorder. So a healthy family can be a protective factor for those that have the diathesis. So really, really interesting. Here you can see it visually, ignore the percentages, but here we can see the higher genetic risk. So these are the people who had mothers with schizophrenia. And in purple, we've got the control group, whose mothers did not have schizophrenia. So we can see here that the highest risk, though the only group that had an increased risk of developing schizophrenia, were those that had a high genetic risk, i.e. their mothers had schizophrenia, and those that were adopted into dysfunctional families. There is no increased risk for the children who had mothers with schizophrenia who were adopted into healthy families, and there was no increased risk for people who were in dysfunctional families with a non-schizophrenic mother. And so it seems here that having a genetic predisposition plus family stress increases one's risk. But genetic predisposition alone or being in a dysfunctional family alone do not increase someone's risk significantly. So a fantastic study here because it tells us that, yep, there are genetic explanations. It also tells us that, yes, there are psychological explanations, and this lends support for family dysfunction. But it also shows that both of those explanations are limited, because genetic explanations alone do not explain why this group was at increased risk, but not this group. And it also shows us that the family dysfunction explanation is also limited, because family dysfunction seems to only be a factor that increases risk when somebody already has that genetic vulnerability. And so this is a fantastic study because it both supports biological and psychological explanations, but it also provides a criticism of them. So the final limitation of this interactionist approach to explaining schizophrenia is that there are still so many questions that remain. We know that there are numerous stresses that contribute to an increased risk of developing schizophrenia, and that these can be biological or psychological, social, etc. But what we don't understand is how exactly these triggers, exactly how these stresses trigger the diathesis. It's not known precisely how each risk will contribute to a diathesis stress interaction for any one specific person. It's very, very complex. We don't exactly know how cannabis increases somebody's risk. We don't exactly know how urban living increases somebody's risk. We don't even understand how early childhood stress leads to changes in the HPA axis. So although we know and we can observe that having some sort of diathesis or some internal vulnerability does seem to interact with some sort of external stressor, there are so many different combinations of these diatheses and so many combinations of these stresses that it is impossible to know for any one individual how that is going to turn out. We can't predict how likely it is somebody is going to develop schizophrenia just by assessing their genetic vulnerability or just by seeing how much they've smoked cannabis. Every individual reacts differently to the same stresses, and different amounts of vulnerability are going to increase or decrease somebody's risk for schizophrenia. So even the interactionist approach, which is a holistic approach, cannot fully explain the onset. There are mechanisms involved that we don't fully understand yet. And so it's still a really limited model, even though it's better than perhaps the more reductionist models of just using a biological or just using a psychological explanation. It's still so complex.